Way back in 2013, I went to a conference where I got a free 23andMe kit. I thought it was pretty cool that there was a tool that could tell me about my genes, giving me an idea of whether or not I had an increased risk of things like breast cancer or Alzheimer's. So I spit in the little tube and I mailed it off. I participated despite the fact that I was also a little bit concerned about handing my genetic data over to a corporation. At the time, I came up with a few potential problems. For a start, learning that I had an increased risk of certain disorders might increase my anxiety, but that would be offset by an ability to try to change my habits to mitigate that risk. And that happened. It came back that I was at an increased genetic risk for macular degeneration, so I shared that with my optometrist, and now I get screened regularly for that. Another concern I had was privacy-based. The company was pretty new at the time, so there wasn't a lot of information out there about the potential risks, but the big obvious one that I could think of was based on U.S. insurance companies getting their hands on my genetic data and using it to decline to pay for care based on a pre-existing condition that I was literally born with. Because, we live in a dystopia, or at least I do. But 23andMe promised to never sell or share my data without my explicit consent. And also, honestly, at that point, I was a bit of a doomer on that subject. I figured that an insurance company was eventually going to bankrupt me anyway, so I went for it in the interests of science. And honestly, I'm glad I did it. I learned more about genetics in general. It encouraged me to stay on top of breaking genetics research. And I did learn some stuff about my own genes. In the decade plus since I first spit in that tube, a few more issues have come to light. As I mentioned in this video in 2019, researchers discovered that telling people that they were genetically predisposed to be more easily winded during exercise made those people more easily winded when they were running on a treadmill compared to people who were told that they were genetically predisposed to be able to run longer. And that was regardless of whether or not those people actually had those genes, which do exist. Also, telling people their genes made them more likely to feel satiated when eating led those people to eat less. So even though genes are not destiny, learning about our genes can make us more likely to act as though they are. That's a pretty powerful effect, especially considering how little we really know about exactly how certain genes affect our lives. And of course, as my fellow true crime fans know, around that same time, the world learned about forensic genealogy with the arrest of the infamous Golden State Killer. He was caught by investigators who compared crime scene DNA to commercial online DNA databases, and they found his relatives. They built family trees and narrowed down suspects until they finally landed on Joseph James DeAngelo, only catching him thanks to people using these services who happened to have the same great-great-great-grandparents as him. As a true crime fan, a puzzle fan, and a science fan, I found this case absolutely fascinating. As a critic of the American justice system and a privacy advocate, I found it troubling. How would I feel if my DNA led police to arrest someone for a rape or a murder? I mean, if they actually did it, I guess I'd be fine with it. But if they didn't do it, I don't know. It's complicated. Another issue that came to light in the past few years is how can a for-profit corporation remain solvent when they make all of their money on a product that, by default, a customer can only buy once? And that's why today the biggest problem everyone is facing with 23andMe is that they have declared bankruptcy. And that means that if you're one of their customers, your genetic data might end up in the hands of someone you don't trust as much as you trusted 23andMe. 23andMe has stated that they'll be protecting your data throughout the bankruptcy proceedings, but people are understandably skeptical about that, considering that they already gave hackers access to the data for 7 million customers a few years ago, giving up user passwords and allowing the hackers to see users' family trees. That's why California Attorney General Rob Bonta issued a consumer alert reminding people that the Genetic Information Privacy Act and the California Consumer Privacy Act give customers the right to demand that 23andMe delete all their data and even destroy any samples they might still have on file. Obviously, that's for Californians, but it's part of the reason why customers anywhere should be able to log in and do that. And Bonta gives step-by-step instructions for anyone who wants to. I'm not going to read it all, but feel free to pause here if you would like to go through it. So, is this a big deal? Should you delete your data? The Washington Post urges you to absolutely go delete your data right the fuck now. Meanwhile, my good friend, Dr. Jay McCreight, who used to work at 23andMe, points out that he's not worried and will not be deleting his data, pointing to this piece in Reason to explain why. Now, I trust Jay's judgment when it comes to genetic stuff, so even though I was leaning towards deleting my own data, I clicked through to see the argument on the other side. And I have to say, I found the arguments presented by Ronald Bailey, Reason's science correspondent, pretty weak, but for the sake of presenting both sides, I'll try to sum them up fairly and also offer my own thoughts. He starts by stating that the privacy implications aren't that dire because there are other ways that our privacy is compromised, like the government having some people's fingerprint data and facial recognition software existing. In my opinion, the existence of other privacy concerns doesn't mean we should ignore this one. Next, he says that we shouldn't be worried about our data being used for forensic genealogy because, unlike other companies, 23andMe requires a warrant before giving away user data. That's great until you realize that 23andMe has just declared bankruptcy and could sell your data to another company as an asset, and that new company might choose to not require a warrant. He next says we shouldn't worry about hackers getting our data because hackers frequently steal sensitive medical data from hospitals and healthcare companies. I will refer you back to my first point. One privacy violation doesn't mean we should ignore another. Worried about someone using your data to blackmail you? Bailey thinks that's only a problem if you've committed an unsolved murder or rape, ignoring things that are way, way more likely to be fodder for blackmail, like having a secret child out of wedlock. Hackers aren't out there solving crimes and then using that to extort money from the criminal, but it would be pretty easy to just look at someone's family tree and come to some conclusions. Worried about your name, address, and birth date being used by a hacker to impersonate you? Bailey says that information is not unique to 23andMe. Do I need to tap the sign again? Your data being accessed elsewhere does not mean you should ignore your data being accessed here. Are you worried about your genetic data being used by insurers to deny you coverage? Well, Bailey tells a story about how an insurer used his blood test to double the cost of his premium. I had to reread this section several times because it so thoroughly counters his own thesis that I was baffled as to why he would include it. But when I sat down to make this video, I realized he's probably just making that same pointless argument again. It's already happening in other ways, so why worry about it happening with your genetic data? His final point is the only actual argument in the entire piece, and I suspect it's the reason why my science-loving friend isn't deleting his data. I invite my fellow 23andMe customers to consider why nearly 80% of you agreed to participate in 23andMe research efforts. Besides hoping to gain some insights about yourself, you also want to help advance medical science. The company may or may not survive, but its stored genetic data remains a scientifically and medically valuable resource that some other research firm or institution may use to help develop new treatments and cures. Keep that in mind and resist being panicked into deleting your data for some speculative gain in privacy. And I do think that is mostly a valid point. I am one of those customers who opted into the research program, but I did spend a lot of time going back and forth over whether I should. On the one hand, yeah, I do want my genetic data to be used to develop new treatments and cures. On the other hand, I understand that large private corporations use public data to develop those treatments only to then sell them back to the public at an inflated price. And so the same genetic data that leads to a new treatment can also be used by an insurer to withhold that treatment from the person who needs it. It's a shitty situation. And so at the end of the day, I personally am deleting my data for an actual gain in privacy. It's not speculative, it's real. If a corporation does not have my private data, I have more privacy than when a corporation does have my private data. Only you can decide whether or not you want to delete your data, but that's my view of it all. My only worry now is this. What if Darwin's Ark goes bankrupt next and I need to do the same analysis on whether to delete Indy's data? I don't need hackers threatening to tell the world that he's part Cocker Spaniel. Ugh. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.